Well, welcome everyone to our Reshaping Church conversation for June of 2022. Today we are very excited to have Reverend Dr. Letiah Fraser here with us. Letiah received her bachelor's in adolescent education with a concentration in English from Nyack College in New York, her Master of Divinity from Nazarene Theological Seminary in Kansas City, and received her Doctor of Ministry from Nazarene Theological as well, just a few months ago in April of this year, with a focus on disability theology and spiritual formation. Letiah currently serves as a resident pastor and organizer with the Open Table, Kansas City, and an organizer with the Kansas Poor People's Campaign and National Call for Moral Revival, a hospital chaplain at a local trauma hospital, and an International Coaching Federation life coach in training. She's a contributing writer to the devotional We Cry Justice, Reading the Bible with the Poor People's Campaign, and recently has been named one of the 10 Christian women shaping the church in 2022 by Sojourners. So we are excited to have her here. And in addition to all those things, Letiah is a good friend. And really happy to have her sharing here with us. With the folks who are logged on now, this video is also posted on Central's YouTube page, and we do have a lot of folks that watch when this is over, and so we welcome all of you. And with that, I'm going to turn it right over to Letiah.
Hello, well, I'm glad for the folks that are here. I was telling Jessica before people popped on that, like, when you do your dissertation in this topic, I have so much information. How do you fit it all in a presentation? And part of my project was to come up with a curriculum. So that is to say, it's going to be participatory. So hopefully we will all jump in. I just want to stop for here and just say this will be a space where opinions and thoughts and questions are welcome, even if it may not be in the best language. We want to assume good intent in that way. Okay, so I'm going to read this, and I should have said, if you have paper, pen, or your computer or whatever you use to write with, I'm going to read this passage from the Voice translation, and I want to invite us, as I'm reading, to think about the word culture. So here it is. After I heard these who would be sealed, I looked and saw a huge crowd of people, which no one could even begin to count, representing every nation and tribe, people and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, wearing white robes and waving palm branches. They cried out with one loud voice, "Salvation comes only from our God who sits upon the throne and from the Lamb." I'm wondering what, if I can move this first. Okay, here we go. Just take a few minutes to define the word culture. And there's a small group of us. So I told Jessica if we could do 2 or 3 folks in a smaller group, and I'm more than willing to jump into, but I just wanted to see if we can figure out a definition for culture, a definition for disability, and a definition for disability culture. Please try not to look up the definition in the dictionary, mainly because, especially for the word disability and disability culture, I don't like any of them. So I'd be interested to know what we come up with as a group here. So Jessica, if you can pop us into breakout groups.
We didn't get very far. Just making a confession.
Letiah, you're muted.
There we go. I didn't think we would with just 2 minutes, but I would love to hear some of the thoughts that did happen. And I'm gonna reshare. I forgot that when you do breakout groups, then it also takes that away. So any thoughts?
So the question was, what thoughts about all three of those definitions?
Or if you didn't get that far, like whichever one you got to, it's fine.
Well, I'll just jump in and say, I think that we came to a culture being a group of people with a common identity that had some similar norms, behaviors, values that they share and that they pass on to succeeding generations.
Mhm. Has anybody thought of disability as a culture at all?
You know, I learned more. I'm going to talk too much here, and we have a student, Debbie Buschultz, I think. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce her last name. A DMin student that did her dissertation, her DMin on blind culture, and so I learned a lot about that. So that's when I started thinking, as well as some reading, but especially about like what blind culture means within our society for people. But yeah.
That's a good point. So disability, I will assert that is a culture that doesn't deny that the physical disabilities or things that the conditions we have, right? But if we understand disability as a culture, I think it opens it up more. And I use the word disability, not everybody within the disability community does. I use the word disability because I don't see it as a bad word, and I know that folks use a lot of other terms to describe people who are part of the disability culture, and some of those make me cringe, some of those make me laugh, but I use disability because we can define it in a way that doesn't have the stigma in it. Like, I have a disability, but it's only a part of who I am. So if we understand it that way. And I would say, if you have any questions as we go along, this is more of a discussion, so it's great. I thought I'd share some stats that there's over 1 billion people who live with some sort of disability. So there are both visible and invisible disabilities. If we think about visible disabilities, so folks that use a wheelchair, folks that use crutches, and invisible ones, folks that have mental health disabilities, there's many. And then 1 million adults in the United States live with a disability. 1 in 4 people in the US live with a disability. 1 in 4 women. 1 in 3 people with disabilities do not have healthcare, because it's also a pre-existing condition, and healthcare in America needs to be reformed. But that's another thing for another day. The number of people with a disability are drastically increasing. This is due to demographic trends and increases in chronic health conditions, especially with COVID. Disability crosses all other intersecting identities, including but not limited to race, gender, identity, socioeconomic status, education level. Disability is the one minority group in which one can join at any time. Typically, if you are born Black or Latinx, you're born that way. But disability you can be either born with or develop later in life. Is there any statistic that I kind of read through that kind of sticks out to you for any reason?
I have a question. Is the 1 in 3 people with disabilities that do not have health care, is that in the US specifically?
That is in the US specifically. Because of the pre-existing conditions. So even though theoretically you may have access to healthcare, but it's going to cost more because of the potential increased cost to care. So yeah. Any others that stick out or questions?
One thing about, I was surprised. I have a relative that has a lot of physical illness issues that have resulted in some disability and therefore the inability to work. And so I was kind of urging her, well, apply for disability insurance, and the consequences, actually, my sister-in-law, my brother is past 70 and has to keep working in order to have insurance for her, even though she's probably about 10 years younger. So they're trying to figure this out. And I was surprised at the limitations or the requirements for disability, according to what they understand. I think she had to have worked 10 years or something like this in some kind of time frame or something. I'm not quite sure that I understand it, but I had talked to a disability attorney. I know there's a long waiting list, but you're talking about not having health care. I was surprised how someone with her level of problems couldn't see how she could get into disability insurance.
Yeah, I think especially the system is set up so that you are first denied, and then if you have enough energy or people behind you to then apply again. And it's not a catch-all either, because you become very limited in the things that you can and cannot do, which increases the cycle of poverty potentially as well. So there's more than 6 elements in any culture, but I want to briefly name the 6 elements of disability culture. Part of my dissertation was that I had to prove that disability was a culture. So this is what I was thinking through. Thinking about disability history, because every culture has a history, language, worldviews, disability in the church, but I won't hit that too much, but we'll talk about it a little bit. Disability theology, and then disability theology and some practical applications. So people with disabilities have existed for as long as people have existed, but the beginning of our history is that we were put away in institutions, or we didn't survive because there wasn't enough medical care, or because society saw if a parent had a child with a disability, that then it was something wrong with that family. So people with disabilities didn't get the main stage or come out of hiding until World War I and World War II, when vets were coming back with disabilities, because then at that point, people with disabilities were their uncles and fathers and people that they knew. And then the baby boom. So with the I don't know, explosion of more babies, there is just the higher probability of children with disabilities. And then the polio epidemic as well. And then the formaldehyde poisoning, which I understand to be a medicine that was given to pregnant folks for nausea, but they didn't realize that it also would cause birth defects. So you're having this growing number of this group called children with disabilities now. And then you have the disability rights movement, and there's a whole bunch of stuff in between here, but the disability rights movement, which took its cues from the civil rights movement, you have folks like Justin Dart, the guy with the hat on, who's credited as the father of the Americans with Disabilities Act. You have folks like Ed Roberts, who's credited as starting the disability rights movement and the independent living movement, which was focused on people with disabilities living their own lives and not being managed or you know, in institutions, but living lives in the community just as their peers without disabilities. And then Judy Heumann, who is still doing lots of disability work. She was a teacher in New York City who was first denied her access to be a teacher because she had a disability. And then at that time, they were asking folks to do physicals, which she couldn't pass the physical test. But since then has served and been a part of shaping laws that help in the education of folks with disabilities. Then we have 1973, right? The 504 Act, which gives access to folks with disabilities in buildings and in services that receive federal funds. And I'm always amazed by, like, 1973 wasn't that long ago. And then we have the same thing for education, that folks with disabilities will receive a fair and appropriate education just as their non-disabled peers. And then we have the 1990s Americans with Disabilities Act, which has been named the Emancipation Proclamation for folks with disabilities. And yet it remains the law that is probably the least enforced, and especially in the church. The church has lobbied against having to implement the things that are required by the Americans with Disabilities Act, and they won the right to be exempt. So I wonder, just some thoughts, just to spur some conversation. What would you add to your working definition of disability culture as we've been chatting? And what intrigued you or disturbed you maybe about the history of people with disabilities, however brief that was?
Letiah, I can speak to number 3, although with my own knowledge of the history, having been a newspaper person in the 80s and 90s on Cape Cod in Massachusetts, when the town was told they had to make curb cuts for wheelchairs, and the town officials kept saying, they kept delaying doing it. And they said, oh, it'll get done someday. People just have to be patient. And I remember how enraged that made me, though I do not have a physical disability.
Mhm.
Because it echoed way too strongly the civil rights movement, and abolition, right back to abolition. Oh, slavery is going to die out within 100 years. No, nobody should have to wait to be able to be a full and participating person in society. And I live in senior housing. I live on the second floor. I have really bad arthritis in my knees. And there are no fire escapes. If were a fire, I would somehow, in a panic, have to get poorly built windows open, screens put out, and throw one of those aluminum ladders over the windowsills and climb down. I doubt I can even do that. So I entirely empathize with any restraints to living a full life with any kind of disability. Thank you for.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Any other thoughts before we keep going?
I was just thinking, Letiah, you commented on how kind of 1973 wasn't that long ago, and then to see American with Disabilities Act passed in the 1990s, which was really not that long ago. I mean, I knew that was the time frame, but it still just always surprises me that just how recent that was. And then, like you said, that paired with how the little enforcement of it.
Yes, it's disturbing that the church has lobbied against it. You'd think that would be a primary proponent. My sense in churches a lot of times is that they're kind of barely just making it financially, and the cost factor of change kind of puts them in a place where they oppose it. But it still is kind of disturbing to think of the church, or much of the church, being on the wrong side of this
They
issue.
did that was one of the reasons they cited for not for lobbying against it. But think about the 1990s, right? Church people were going to church then still, more than they are right now. And the interesting thing is, as the congregations get older, oftentimes that's when things like making it more accessible happens, right? So that folks can come to the place that they've been accustomed to coming to, but also thinking larger, not just about, oh, I can get in the building, or I can use the bathroom, but what does the service look like so that all people can participate, that you have folks with disabilities in mind as you design your liturgy, those sorts of things. That doesn't necessarily cost money. Okay, I want to invite us to listen to songs. I think I hit sound, so let me know if I didn't. You probably will know the first one. I didn't pick it because I love it, because I don't, but I want to invite us all to listen to this song in light of what's the message it sends about people with disabilities, and then think about the places of worship where you find yourself, and what the typical music that is shared, what it says about people with disabilities. So So hold that, write some thoughts down. I don't want to play it again. And then I want us to listen to this song, and then we'll have a discussion.
You gave us these bodies and you called them good. You gave us these bodies and you called them good. We are easily damaged. Have you seen the scars? That's just scratching the surface, more beneath where those are. You gave us these bodies and you called them good. You gave us these bodies and you called them good. May we love them as you do. Let us love them as you do. Inside, outside, through and through. Let us love them as you do. But we do so much damage. Have you seen the scars? We keep hurting each other. Sometimes that's just how we are. You gave us these bodies and you called them good. You gave us these bodies and you called them good. May we love them as you do. Let us love them as you do. Inside, outside, through and through. Let us love them as you do. These bodies, they are fearfully, wonderfully made. Don't believe the lies some say. No, our flesh and bones, our hearts and hands are loved in every way. Yeah, our flesh and bones, our hearts and hands are loved in every way. You gave us these bodies and you called them good. You gave us these bodies and you called them good. May we love them as you do. Let us love them as you do. Inside, outside, through and through. Let us love them as you do. Let us love them as you do.
So some thoughts as we've heard both of those songs in terms of people with disabilities. And church and our bodies.
One of the things that I thought about while listening to that song was, the aspect of God healing people. And, I go into a different church every week, and 99% of the churches have a bulletin, and, an entire page of the bulletin has a prayer list of people that they're praying for, they say. And how many people on that prayer list, do they really expect God to actually heal? What does that, how does that really work out? And it kind of reminds me of I forget the exact, the pool of Siloam. I don't know if that may not be the right term. That may be a mispronounced term, but where the angel comes and stirs the water. And it's like all these churches are waiting for some angel to come and stir the water, and maybe one of them on that whole list of people will actually be healed.
Mhm.
That's what occurred to me while I was listening to the song.
Yeah, thank you.
It strikes me too that like we've decided what being healed means.
Mhm.
And it's that was really kind of the biggest thing that struck me, is that we have these kind of narrow preconceived notions about what it means to be healed and whole,
Mhm.
which may be entirely wrong.
All right, I'm gonna keep going and let's I want to play it again. Okay. So just in every culture there are some taboo words. Of course, I only picked a few, there are many. But any thoughts as to what some of those taboo words might be?
Cripple.
Mhm. Well, yes and no. We'll talk about that too. Yeah. There are pretty universally, these two words are taboo. So handicapped. Now I don't know, like, how myths go and like stories and legends, but part of the reason why this word is such a negative word is that there's a story, and probably tied to the biblical story as well, that folks with disabilities would have a cap in their hand, like, and ask for money. So that you can picture that as like, if you are a person with a disability, then this is what you are like expected, or like the vision of your life. So that one, and then the R word, which isn't written out much more, but for folks who are part of the disability community, who have an intellectual disability. So those two words are generally taboo in most disability circles. So there are at least 3 different types of languages that are spoken or used within disability culture. One is sign language, which I think most are familiar with the idea. And then the other is identity first language and people first language. So sign language, there are many different sign languages, and then in the US, American Sign Language is used. Sign language is a language and not a translation into English. Many deaf people who use sign language interpreters, but not translators. It's a whole different language. Most deaf people don't even consider themselves disabled. I worked with a guy who was my boss, and he did not, and we would have fights all the time about it. And his point was that he can do everything that somebody who wasn't deaf could do except hear. And I would argue back and say, well, then I can do everything that people except not walk, as correctly. But there's a strong sense that in deaf culture, that it's a culture and it's really not their problem, it's our problem because we don't know the language, we're ignorant of the language. And so then again, just something to be aware of misappropriating sign language. I see this a lot in the church. People think it's cool to like learn how to do this song and sign. If it's so that folks that are deaf can also participate in the service, that's one thing. If it's because we think it's cute, I don't know. I think that would advise us to think about it differently. We perhaps do that with other languages too, and that would help us to think about that too. If we use Spanish just because we think it'd be cool to sing it in a different language, if the intent is not so that folks can fully participate in the service. And then there's identity first language, where the disability is first and then the identity. So when someone said crippled, I said, yeah, no, maybe. Because there are people within the disability community, those who are part of the autism community would use identity first language. So they would say, I'm autistic, because it is a central part of who they are, how they understand and navigate the world. Or deaf folks would also say that I'm deaf. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. That's who I am. I do not, well, I switch back and forth between disability, identity first language, and people first language in this. If I know I'm in a group of folks that are all people with disabilities, then we use identity first language a lot, because we know what we're talking about. We don't have to do a lot of explaining. But if I'm in a mixed group of people or giving presentations, I use people first language, which emphasizes the person, that we are people first, and that happen to have a disability, that the disability is just a part of who we are, but there are other things that make up who we are as well. So just some, there's a whole list of them, but just some that I want to highlight today. So when using people first language, again, emphasizing person first, you wouldn't use words like normal, atypical, healthy, because people with disabilities are healthy. Generally, there are some people who are not, but then there are some people who don't have disabilities who are not healthy. Person with a mental health disability instead of mentally ill, emotionally disturbed, nuts, all the things that we've all heard. A person who uses a wheelchair instead of someone who's wheelchair bound or confined. Person that uses a wheelchair is not confined to it. They can get out of it, whether by themselves or with the assistance of someone else. And actually, it is the thing that helps them to participate in the world, get around. So actually makes them more mobile. Little person or person with dwarfism instead of midget or dwarf. And then we talked about the word handicapped. And you'll see it around more and more now, and using accessible buses, accessible bathroom, accessible parking, because it's accessible not only to people with disabilities, but to those without disabilities as well. I know I've gone into bathrooms and there are people who don't appear to have a disability, because I don't know, right? Can't see everything. Who often use the accessible bathroom or other things. So any comments, thoughts, questions around identity first language, sign language, people first language. All right. So maybe what we can either, I think we're small enough, we can just talk out loud. If you were a person with a disability, or if you are a person with a disability like myself, would you prefer to use people first language or identity first language? And then what songs are sung or played in your church, keeping in mind that lens of disability?
So I am disabled. I'm newly disabled, but I prefer identity first language because everything I do is impacted by my disability, and it can't be separated from who I am.
Yeah.
As we were listening to the first song, Mary, did you know, I was kind of writing down all of the verbs in there. Walk, seeing, leaping, hearing, speaking. And then, I mean, from my own experience, I think it dawned on me that delivering and bearing children is within that song, and that's within a lot of our songs in the church too. And so then I started Googling, went down that rabbit hole in my mind for a little while, and found that in 1998, the US Supreme Court upheld that infertility is a disability under the American with Disabilities Act. And so there's something just connected there in my thinking within, as we were listening to that song, about just the many, many, many ways that songs and sermons and prayers and other sorts of things in our churches are exclusive at best, damaging more likely. So I really appreciated that song was a good example of all of those things, and it made me think of so many more.
Yes, I was like, what's one that like most people will know? So that's why I was like, any other thoughts before we move on? So worldviews, each culture has more than one worldview. There are a number of worldviews within the disability culture as well, but there are two main ones. So I'll focus on that. So there's the medical model and then the social model of disability. I will tell you that because I also worked at a disability rights organization for many, many years. So before my dissertation, I would say I'm a social model of disability person, and I still am. And then I thought, oh wait, but like the medical model is also needed and helpful. And so there's another lady, Kramer, who talks about the limited model of disability that like combines both the medical model, like that acknowledges that like we have limitations and limitations aren't bad, that everybody has limitations, but folks with disabilities, you can just see them more or they're noticed more. But I'll talk about the medical model. So the medical model says that the person with the disability is the problem, right? They have this condition or something that is causing the disability, right? So the problem is located in the person, and needs to be fixed or mediated, right? Because not all disabilities can be cured, or so that's why we have surgeries and, you know, assistive devices, which are great. I love my crutches. I call them my good legs. So, but we have to be careful that, of course, the doctors and the hospitals focus in the medical model. I want them to. But as people who are in church and do other sorts of ministry and work, that we make sure not to focus in the medical model as much. This is where I grew up in a Pentecostal church. So I'll say prayers for healing, that I would be someone without a disability can be damaging, because everywhere else in my world, I was being told having a disability is fine. In school, I had all the accommodations I needed to function and succeed. And it wasn't until I started going to church that people started to say something was wrong with me. So want to be careful of our messaging, but also aware of the very real needs that folks with disabilities have. So the social model of disability says that, yes, we have disabilities, but the problem lies in the structures in our society, in our buildings, in our programs that aren't accessible to everyone. So you'll know by the ways folks talk and interact which one of these models they lean towards. So if you thought about your church or place where you worship, which one would you say it leans towards, either the medical or social model?
I'm happy to say that the Episcopal Church I belong to now, though mostly online, is definitely the social model and does everything it can to erase any barriers to being a full participant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is a thing to think about. Yeah, go ahead. Was somebody going to say something?
I was just gonna jump in with a thought. When you said the word place, like the place where you worship, and I started thinking about the last 2 years and how place has changed a lot, and people worshiping online, and in some ways that can be more accessible, and for some, and in some ways it's not more accessible for others. So just another kind of complex piece of thinking about communities of worship, I guess.
Yeah, and to think more, like, obviously access, whether however you access church, either like in person or online, but thinking about the structures of your church too. Like, do you know anybody who's a pastor with a disability, or serves in some way in leadership, right? Not just as people who attend, which is fine, but that you would see folks with disabilities at every level. So just things to reflect on. Some harmful theology. Let me go back. We gotta get that one. So disability is often linked to suffering. While there are some folks whose disability does cause them pain, That does not mean their whole life is like, if you have a disability, it equals suffering. I've heard like people say, oh, I'm glad I don't have a disability because I think that's worse than death, right? So when you say that, what do you mean? And what are you conveying to folks with disabilities? If you, I mean, it's also in the Bible, right? So like, this happened because, and therefore it's a sign of suffering because of something that was done, either by that person or, some generational situation that happened. So the other one is people with disabilities are an inspiration. This is also harmful because people with disabilities are people and therefore have bad days and good days. And what does it mean to say that, oh, I mean, I literally have gotten congratulated for being outside and going shopping. What does it say about the expectations we have of folks with disabilities if by doing something that is an everyday task is inspirational? And what does it say about folks without disabilities? It's like this. There's a disability activist. She's died, but she called it disability porn, right? Like, we look at those inspirational stories. We hear it around this time a lot when like one person with a disability gets asked out by like somebody without a disability, and they go to prom, and it's like, oh, so, and to think about that in terms of what are you saying? And it's not that people with disabilities and without disabilities can't, be friends and in relationships with one another, but not when it's held to that inspirational, stance. People with disabilities are superhero, right? Or special, like there is something about us, or we have a direct connection to God or something, which I'll tell you, I don't, and I'm not a superhero. But there's this thing of like, either I'm sad for you or you've been given a special assignment. Blessed to have a disability means that you've been blessed by God. Or from Paul's the passage from Paul, has been given a thorn in the flesh, right? As disability, it's because it's safeguarding folks with disabilities from pride. And if that's the case, then every single person on the planet should have a disability, and everybody does not. So just things to think about. That disability is equated to sin. And that's often, even in Mary, Did You Know? The lame will leap, right? Or Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, right? I once was blind, but now I see. Well, what if I become a faithful person, but I'm still blind? So I don't know, just to be mindful of our language around equating disability with sin. And that in some way, disability warps the image of God in the person with a disability. Like, you need healing so that you can reflect God more. And we might not say it that way, but our theology, some of our sermons do say that. So another thing to be aware of. And then people with disabilities are charity cases. You don't see this as much, but thinking about like the Jerry Lewis telethons, there have been a little bit of that. I can't remember the hospital now, that I've been seeing them more with the little kids. And like, if you give which I'm not saying we shouldn't give to charities, but again, how are we using folks with disabilities? And are we using them to like pull on the heartstrings of a non-disabled society? People with disabilities need to be prayed for, or I say prayed on, because now if somebody asks and wants that, I mean, obviously we want to be, but oftentimes that is assumed about a person with a disability and not often true, especially for folks who've been born with a disability. See it as just a part of who they are. And if we understand disability as culture, then by praying away someone's disability, you may be praying away someone's culture and cultural understanding of themselves and how they navigate the world. And we talked about this a little bit, to be careful that disability is not referenced negatively. And we do this all the time, blind to the truth, or Jesus, will help you overcome disability. The disability isn't something to be overcome, but a culture to understand, people to know, those sorts of things. So then disability theology emerged in the 90s by Nancy Eastland, has been noted as the mother of disability theology. And it's a form of liberation theology that isn't as, I think it's gaining in more popularity in like the wider culture, but disability theology, people with disabilities move from object to subject. So one of the slogans of the disability rights movement was nothing about us without us. So folks with disabilities, especially if you've been born with a disability, have a lot of medical people or caseworkers or people that speak for. Oftentimes, I mean, I'll go to a restaurant with a friend and they'll say, what does she want? And then my friend will be like, I don't know, ask her. But it's just that idea too. Disability theologies amplifies the voices of people with disabilities. So if we think about the story in scripture where there is the man with a physical disability who's on a mat and his 4 friends that carry him to Jesus, one, he doesn't say anything that we know of. And often those 4 friends are amplified as like, oh, the people who help this poor person to Jesus. And then, but disability theology says, well, I wonder, he had to give some consent in order to allow people to carry him all the way to wherever Jesus was. I don't know about you, but I'm just not going to let somebody pick me up and move me. And I think that a lot of the scriptures that focus on healing were more about being a prophetic voice in a society that didn't leave space for folks with disabilities to engage in the society. So that healing was something that Jesus did secondarily. It was often first, your sins are forgiven, and then get up and walk or whatever. And that was because otherwise they could not access religious life or economic life. So if we understood the healing in that way, I think it would be a prophetic voice to our world today. Disability theology does not practice erasure. So again, healing or the desire for healing, not that there aren't people who wish for that, is a practice of erasure, that you don't want people with disabilities to exist. The church recognizes the possibility, of disability, right? So like I said, we can all, at some point, if we keep living, have a disability, but see it as possibility. What are the many ways in which folks within the disability community can be active members of our communities, our churches, societies, all the things that we access. The church engages in social justice as part of its mission. So disability rights are civil rights. So we talk about healthcare is still something that folks with disabilities have a hard time accessing. Folks with disabilities, we're talking about marriage equality. A lot of folks with disabilities can't get married because if they did that, they would lose access to the healthcare that they did have. Like folks who need help with cooking and cleaning and dressing. If we were to pay for that out of our pockets, nobody could afford that. But so then you have to make the choice of, do I get married or not? Because our laws haven't caught up to that. The church prepares itself for the presence and full participation of people with disabilities. So not just, in your buildings, but think about your liturgy. Does your liturgy include things like stand if you're able, or stand in body or in spirit? I often say, because people ask me, what then do you say? And I think we train our children in our public schools, at least, to put their hands over their heart and say the Pledge of Allegiance. And yet, if the purpose of standing is to give reverence to God or the scripture, why not instead offer that we stand? Because for some folks, standing is helpful. Or put your hand over your heart, or in whatever way feels like reverence to you, if that's silence. Yeah, and just be mindful of those things. What is it? So when you hear the term disabled God, what kind of pops into your head? Well, will somebody read this for me? This is a quote from Nancy Eastland's book, The Disabled God. And she was challenged to, she said, there isn't much disability theology in the 90s. So she was challenged that would be her doctoral work. And so this is her vision of God when she closed her eyes and thought about it. Would somebody read it for me?
I can do that.
Okay.
She saw God in a sip-puff wheelchair. That is, the chair used mostly by quadriplegics, enabling them to maneuver by blowing and sucking on a straw-like device. Not an omnipotent, self-sufficient God, but neither a potable, suffering servant. In this moment, I beheld God as survivor, unpitying and forthright. I recognized the incarnate Christ in the image of those judged not feasible, unemployable, with questionable quality of life. Here was God for me.
Does anything stick out, or what emotion does it evoke? Well, for me,
What?
and go ahead. Somebody was going to say, so go ahead.
It's okay, Letiah. Sorry about that.
No,
I
you're
guess
good.
for me, a little bit, it evoked kind of images that we get in Philippians, right? Of Jesus, emptying himself of all of the godness, to be present in human form. And some of it, this really drew me to that sort of image.
Yeah.
But
I had to,
but powerful in that.
Yeah. Somebody else was going to say something, I think.
I had to keep rereading it because it was looking at God from a different lens that I'd never seen before.
Mhm.
And so I had to keep reading it to see better the God that they were talking about.
Mhm. One of the central scriptures that disability theology kind of focuses on is Jesus's encounter with Thomas. And that the resurrected Jesus could have chosen to come back or appear in any bodily way, I suppose, and yet Jesus appears as one who is disabled and remains that, and then invites Thomas to touch the very places where his disability is, which is because if you know, folks with disabilities were like unclean and you're not supposed to touch them and you're supposed to be away from them because you can become unclean. And Jesus invites Thomas to do that. And it is in that invitation that Thomas's faith is affirmed. So in talking about, and we'll get here, images, most Protestant churches, and people, if they wear crosses at all, will wear crosses that are not crucifixes. And folks within the disability community who are committed to disability theology will wear crucifixes to say that this is the event in which Jesus was disabled along with being killed. And in that way, Jesus knows what it is to be disabled, just like Jesus knows what it is to be many things, but ways that the disability community can relate to God. And then, yeah, so this is the encounter with Thomas and the other disciples. And I'll quickly do how this might be lived out. The image of God is more fully reflected when all of creation is in community and kinship together, including those with and without disabilities. Sometimes in churches, you'll have like special needs ministries or I don't know what people call them, but that's like a separate but equal situation. And what are ways that we can make the whole experience accessible to everyone? Disability only becomes a tragedy when society fails to provide the things needed to lead one's daily life. And that's Judy Heumann, one of the leaders still of the disability rights movement. Empowering symbols of inclusion. I talked about this, having images of Christ, if that's what you have in your church. We often, I know I see the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus all the time. Why not have a disabled Jesus there too? And then if we understand Jesus as the disabled God, then for those of us who function with the lectionary. You can shape your Advent and Lent and all those seasons around and through the lens of disability theology. Communion, because we're saying that the broken body of Christ is what brings wholeness to us, the disabled body of Christ. And then this is not to ignore your actual physical space. What does your physical space communicate? Things to think about: worship songs, we talked about that. Liturgy, your worship experience as a whole, communion, the way in which baptism is done, altar calls, Lent, Ash Wednesday, alternative formats. Do people with disabilities have access to every level of leadership in your church or participation? All right, I wanted to leave time. Okay, it's not 11, we have 12 minutes. So 2 things I want to do, if there's any last questions, and then just a 1-word reflection that you are, 1 or 2 word reflection around what you're taking with you today. So questions first, anybody? Okay, well, if there's no questions, any reflections?
I use a compound word.
Yes, you can.
Thank you. Soul touching.
I have a 3-word reflection, but they're short words.
Okay.
Okay. Ready to act.
Can you say more about that?
The theological, historical, cultural foundation that you laid out, and then the challenges for us to think about our faith communities, is so I'm ready to take that challenge, ready to take some of that knowledge and move forward with that.
And if you haven't already, I would suggest, I mean, there are so many, but the foundational work was the disabled God. So every other work in the realm of disability theology will reference the disabled God. So. Any other reflections?
My 1 word would be comforting.
Do you want to say more about that, or you can leave it at your 1 word?
It's just I've never heard before of the concept of Jesus being disabled, and it's comforting to know that God knows what that feels like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks for sharing. Any other? If not, Jessica, I don't know if you had any like closing things you needed to do. So also that can happen.
I think my only closing thing is just to say a massive word of thanks to you. This was just really incredible. Really appreciate your work around this topic, sharing it with us today, and appreciate you. So thank you. Thank you for bringing this to us, and for both your scholarly work, your ministerial work, and your organizing work, and how those all came together and what you shared with us today too.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. And there's so much more, but I had an hour and a half. So here you go.
Everyone who has written their dissertation topic and then presented it to us has said that. I hear
No,
this is a
I don't
theme.
know. I don't know how to do that, but I did it. It's good.
You totally did it. Yes. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And this will be up on Central's YouTube page, hopefully later today, for people to be able to reference, use, go back and view the slides and all that sort of thing. So will you join me in just saying a big thank you to Letiah?
Thank you, Letiah.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Letiah.
you, Letiah.
And I have to maybe make an apology to you, Letiah.
Why is
I'm
it-
going to cry because I have probably said on your Facebook page that you are an inspiration. And you are to me, because you make me want to be better at dealing with life. That's enough said.
Yeah. So I don't hate the word. It's like the intention behind it, right? So if one is using that word because I, got out of bed today or like tied my shoe or something, then that's different. But like if I'm actually doing something that has inspired you, then that's fine. So
And you inspired me on Freedom Church all the time before I even knew that you had a disability.
so that's the I think the advantage of this world in which we're like more digital now is that folks with disabilities have greater access to spaces, because some folks you can't tell they have a disability, some folks you still can, but yeah.
Well, thank you again, Letiah. Thank you all for being here today. Appreciating each one of you, and be well and take care. Until next time. Bye.
Bye.